Hello, everyone joining us from CalRBS. We're here in the inaugural trip of CalRBS to New York City. I'm Sean Pessin, project manager, and I am here today with Aaron Salik and Beldan Sezen, and we're going to talk a little bit about distribution, artist books, rare materials, so if we wouldn't mind starting with a little bit of an introduction. Beldan?
Sure. So I'm Beldan. I am an artist. I make artist books, and I'm also a curator for artist books associated with Booklyn. That's where we work. I think that's enough for now.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Aaron, I'm the owner of TALAS. TALAS has been in my family for about 30 years and was started back in 1962, and we're a distributor of hand bookbinding supplies and conservation materials to museums and libraries and places of the sort.
Very cool. I brought us all together today because of the way that our interests kind of intersect at this movement of rare materials, right? As a book artist, we were talking immediately before the camera started rolling about how Beldan acquires paper from TALAS and transforms them into books, and a little bit about the complex circuit of distribution that brings the paper to TALAS to begin with. And I was wondering if we can think about a little bit how all of that goes when it's moving smoothly. Like, what's a smooth paper transaction?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it probably depends on what type of paper or paper merchant you're talking about, because we obviously sell paper from more common machine-made paper from large mills like a Mohawk, which is just going to be like big sheets of nice smooth paper that you make a journal out of or something, to handmade paper from a small artisan who's making it in the back of their house with a small little beater and some presses and things like that. And so it really, what we offer and what that looks like really varies drastically depending on, what type of material we're talking about. But on the one end of the spectrum, it's, very quick and seamless. Those mass-produced machine-made papers, you send an order to a paper distributor and we get a couple cartons of it in a couple days, and it goes on our shelf and it becomes available for people to buy. The other end of it is we order it and we beg and plead and prod and call and 6 months, a year, sometimes more later, a package arrives at our door and we celebrate and tell people they're finally going to get their paper they've been waiting so patiently for it. So it's that's the scope of it.
Well, from the other end, I can't complain. I'll either go to your website or I come whenever possible to the showroom, pick out my paper, I order it. I either pick it up or it's just been delivered to my door very nicely in a very short time, and I make books. Nice little books.
Oh my God.
And this is a very, very cool. I have to advertise that now. A very cool paper. It's meso thick, and it's just. I made many great books with that, and I'm really grateful for you for that.
Great.
Yeah, it is.
Can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Oh, all right. I can. This is a dummy, a model of a proposal that I will do at my this year's residency at the Herzog August Bibliothek in Germany. Mm-hmm. I won the residency for this year. They have a beautiful collection of artist books, and it started kind of 3 years ago for an exhibition at the Bronx Community College, where I wanted to make a book. The original book is 2 by 2 feet, and you can unfold it. Demonstrate this. So you can read it and page it, but you also can unfold it. And again, the original is 2 by 2 feet, and you hang it. And you can walk into it.
Oh, wow.
And the idea is to experience solitary confinement. So I was very happy to have been able to find this paper at TALAS, because it's very smooth, it's very strong. You can look through it, kind of. And it doesn't have any lines and whatever. So cool, thanks.
yeah, I mean, it's always so fascinating to see what people do with a, you know, to us seemingly just ordinary material, and through the, you know, lens and, you know, creativity of an artist create something magical from it. And it is, and you know, it's just it's always so fascinating to see what the final result of some of those, you know, processes really are. And it takes just you know, so much, you know, probably just testing and trying and failing of different types of materials.
Feeling.
Yeah.
That was my question. You come here and you can feel the material, because
Sure.
that's important. You know, I know now how strong
Yeah.
it is and what it can do, and that's sometimes hard to do if you don't know the material. To just do it from the you know.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's cool.
It very much reminds me of, it was a long time ago, but I remember this artist had come in and was sampling many different types of Japanese papers and was doing these pen drawings, but they were really just dot drawings, just dot, and but was so, you know, particular about finding the right one that had just the right amount of spread of the ink, and he would take that paper and fold it up so it was many layers, so the ink would really sort of go down and spread differently through all the different layers, and created these magical drawings. You know, and it looked, you know, when you unfolded that and it was all the different layers, you know, drawn, stacked together, reminded me of that as well. And it's, just love that creative process to find the right material.
Totally, and you know, it's that's ink too, and yeah, we're still talking books.
Mm-hmm.
Books and paper. It's really pretty cool.
Yeah, and I know from seeing some of your work before that like sampling and found materials are really useful to you, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, Beldan, about the way that you find materials, right? One way that you're sourcing materials is through providers like TALAS, and there are many other sites where you're discovering materials that eventually become books.
Yeah, all right, thanks for that question, Sean. For me, the process begins actually with what I want to say in a book. So it's not necessarily, oh, this is a gorgeous paper, let me make a book out of it. That's not quite it. It's more like, this story wants to be told, and this story needs a form, and it needs a paper. So my first books, okay, that's also hard to explain. Once the story is in my mind and the images are there, I kind of almost intuitionally or randomly find the paper. So the first book was made into old copies of the Booklyn Rail. So I recycle paper or magazines actually, because it fits what I want to say. And by whitening over them, and I'm doing line plots. So this is also line plot, meaning I print. The simplest form of printmaking is a line plot. You have a drawing, you trace it or draw it on an onion skin, you attach it, you ink the onion skin, you flip it, and there it is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how, and you know, by whitening it, so you have always multiple layers that accomplish this, that adds to the story. And that's a great way. So, you know, the first ones were magazines. Then I had a story I wanted to sell, Home of the Brave, and I did photo transfer. These pictures I took through the city, and this is what I wanted to say. And for that, I just used simply butcher's paper, because again, it added to the story, and it was the best thing to do. And since butcher's paper is something that you just rip, I ripped the paper and made a book. So,
Yeah, using that material as a metaphor to, you know, push the message of what the, you know, what you're trying to convey is, you know, what that's all about. And I think it was Richard Minsky was one of the first book artists who really sort of used that, you know, finding the materials that, you know, further conveyed the message of the, you know, the book art that he was creating.
it's a very conceptual approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I love it because no matter where you write or draw upon, it's always a part of it.
Yeah.
And I think, especially considering like that process, right, of going out and finding the thing that speaks the story that you're trying to tell, I think that that is so interesting in light of some of the supply chain problems that we've been experiencing over the last 2.5 years, right? Where, we were talking a little bit about this rare paper to complete an artist project. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, it was a customer who I was talking to yesterday who was waiting on a handmade paper that we sell from Saint Armand, which is a paper mill up in Canada, in Toronto. And it's 12 years he's been working on this project collaboratively with a writer, and they're doing some woodblock printing, and they have one print left to do on this one paper, and the paper is the absolute perfect medium for this last print that will complete this 12-year project. And we don't have the paper, and the woman at Saint Armand, as lovely as she is, just isn't making it right now, and is just has some staffing issues, and yada 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 in terms of everything that you hear these days with COVID and staff shortages and things like that. And she'll make the paper when she makes the paper, and I feel really, this is so important to this customer, and he's been, working on this project for 12 years and is so close to completion and can just sort of like taste it, and it's hanging on this one last component, and eventually he will get it, but it's hard to say when, and I feel for what he's going through, and but very often at the end of the day, the artist will choose to wait because it is just that perfect product or material that they've sifted through thousands and thousands of materials, and this is it. And you get stuck in a way, and you wait. And I mean, we're fortunate enough that that is a lot of our customer base, that they will choose to wait, and we'll do the best that we can to get it to them as quickly as we can. But right now, that's not always so quick, and yeah, it's a challenge.
It's interesting, but the wait could also just add to the artistic process. That might be interesting too.
Absolutely.
Even though frustrating.
Yeah, I think for probably a lot of people, it forces them to, where there is maybe a little bit more latitude to pull back and say, maybe let's think about how we can do it differently, and re-engage that creative sort of process and figure out a plan B, and so I think in some ways maybe it's pushed artists a little bit further. So yeah, I think it can go in lots of different ways for different people depending on how they want to deal with it.
Yeah, I could definitely imagine more reflection, right?
Yep.
A lot of time to really evaluate what you're up to.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I know that, as a teacher and writer and sometimes artist, that I've experienced delays in being able to access materials for my students or for myself. And there isn't really so many great options when those roadblocks sort of come up. I think that a really interesting feature of market consolidation, where fewer and fewer competitors are existing in primary market spaces, that a result of this is a very fragile system. There's not a lot of redundancy, and I think that it's so interesting because so often this is framed as the Amazon comes in and it's going to ruin a market, but the flip side is the TALAS exists and it's kind of the only one that's doing this. It's you have TALAS or you don't have anything, which is not the same kind of market consolidation when you talk about things like Amazon.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've tried to really bridge that gap and anticipate people's needs and try to keep, greater quantities of materials that we know are, either going to be in short supply, or, that people are going, that someone's contacted us and has a project coming up in the future and, hasn't even just committed to buying it from us, but we will just try to be an advocate for them and go out and source that material before we know that they need it to try to, shorten those lead times and make stuff more available. I mean, that's what we always try to do as a company, is to make the, rare and unusual and hard to get products, available in a Amazon type way where you just make a couple clicks at your computer and it shows up at your door in a couple days. And and during these times, it's definitely been a lot more challenging, but we are doing what we can to try to shorten those cycles and get in front of all those problems when we can.
Let me assure you, I did those clicks in the height of COVID when there were really difficulties. It's not satisfying at all. Yeah, and I was glad that you could provide during those times. And sometimes you have to order something because it's quicker, but it's not always the right choice.
Yeah.
I remember last summer when you gave me the tour of all of the stuff that's here, because we're actually in TALAS upstairs right now, and there was just like the half aisle of animal glues, right? And I thought like how exciting that there was like rabbit and sturgeon and just like materials that I actually wouldn't even know where else to look except for here.
Sure.
And in that framing, I was wondering, Beldan, what's the most unusual material you've included in a book that you've made?
Okay. It has nothing to do with TALAS. My recent book, I just finished 3 new books. Okay, where to start here? It's called The Kitchen Table Diaries, and it is the book is made with material that I have collected in the 90s, a little bit 80s and the early 2000s, about the underground LGBTQ movement from Europe, like it was like Amsterdam, Germany, Turkey, and the US. And back in the days, I had all these materials, made a collage out of it on my table, and I just glued it on the table with some plastic, and I took it with me recently because I wanted to make that book. So this is a book that includes material of plastic, whatever you can find, and old paint and rubber and glued together into a collage. I can't pronounce that word still. And the structure is a oxblow structure, the Bustrafon, I guess. Right. If you know the name, please pronounce it for me. It's a. You can fold it out. It's a book, and you fold out. It's just kind of a poster. It goes like a snake. So it's a snake or an oxblow. It's called.
Yeah.
Something. So I'm sorry. You might want to cut that out.
No, I like that.
Start over. Sounds
fascinating.
I like it. I'll put up like one of those like pop-up video things. It's like,
Yeah.
This is what we were talking about.
I might have. No, I did not bring it with me. And that's like, if we go to talk about found material, the whole concept, because it's so old and it's so underground, and the way we did things back in that days with the kitchen table, printmaking, kitchen paper, art making. So it's the whole structure of the book is cardboard and paint and old material. So if you talk, that's the most unusual for me, I guess.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it's like, on the one hand, that's like maybe the rarest material you can be working with is something that is absolutely unique to you.
Yeah.
But it's only in its provenance that it's rare, right? Like it's all things that are pretty common.
Yeah.
And I think it's like such an interesting tension in terms of just like how materials are moving through, and especially like now when everything is suddenly so scarce, right? That the things that are sort of in your immediate orbit or objects that you're using, right, becomes the material that is most at hand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It is maybe common in a flyer as a flyer, but indeed it's not common in the content. It's rare, the content, and it might be a nightmare for libraries because it is such how to conserve that thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The issue of conserving all of these rare materials is also fascinating. And I was wondering if, because I know TALAS provides a lot of archival storage boxes, and there's that really cool CNC machine that cuts them out basically custom. Have you found that there is more action in that space, or like less now that we're in this like conservation scarcity mode?
I mean, you definitely see a lot more artists, be it book artists or painters or just, general sort of artists that are just, coming about and growing up these days, concerned about the permanency of what they're making, which is great. What I sometimes get a little worried about, though, is that it almost gets in the way of their creative process. They're too concerned about just, is it going to last forever, and not just letting them be just, unrestrained and just using those crazy materials and, doing something wild and just, not being so concerned about what happens to it 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now. And there's definitely, great arguments for both sides of that. I mean, yes, to be concerned about it and, have that, always playing in the back of your mind, making those decisions when you choose materials is great, but, just time out and, just roll with it. And it's fine to let a conservator worry about, you're making a great piece of art, let a conservator worry about it. If it becomes something that's valuable and collected and important, they'll worry about it when the time is right, if something happens, but I don't think it should impede the creativity of what you're producing.
Very much agree on that.
Yeah.
Very much, because also not everything is worth collecting. Sometimes it is for that moment. That's one thing. In my, as far as I'm concerned, other things what you say, different institutions have different ideas how they want to conserve things. So why would I be busy with that?
Yeah.
And it's not my job. Also, I don't have knowledge necessarily. Little things, of course. And for example, with Booklyn, we have one artist, James Enos, who simply, he's based in Oregon, and he has these enormous books with markers, and markers just on any paper. So they are totally not archival, but the books are great, and he hinges them with just tape. Okay, but we think they're great, and we managed to sell them to institutions, and they're busy conserving them. So that's fine, right? And he's not thinking about that at all.
That's so interesting, because that was going to be my follow-up question. With many of the books that are moving through Booklyn are made of materials that are unstable, right? Like they're not necessarily shelf stable, or they aren't archival. So
We make boxes, archival boxes.
Yeah, there's the archival boxes. I know when we visited, Marshall showed us those protest kits in the archival boxes. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
But he also showed us a bunch of books, and you also, that I would have a hard time imagining like how to keep those like accessible in special collections environments because of their fragility, or because of the kinds of preservation work that's required. And so it's really interesting to me to hear that those books are privileged by Booklyn, and that they're like things to be celebrated. I think they're like kind of good problems to challenge conservators, like deal with it.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, I don't have the knowledge that I'm going to ask, but do you think like 100 years ago, people were busy to say, oh, we have to conserve it for the next 400 years? Because bookmaking was a means to make books and to spread the news and spread information. So that was the main thing. And it's because we found a book 300 years ago that we want to conserve it, rightfully, of course, right?
I mean, but the materials that were available at that time were also, I think, much more stable, generally speaking. They were not as varied as what we have at our disposal today.
Do I have to say bookworm? No, seriously, I mean organic materials, right?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, pests and things like that are natural, problems that, any book or any type of, thing that exists in our world, can be subjected to. But I think just talking about materials themselves, we've definitely seen a lot more, fragility in terms of, the stability of those materials as time has marched on.
And
Sorry. No, that is true. But I think what I'm trying to say is different time have different needs. What I mentioned, like the Herzog August Bibliothek, when founded 450 years ago, they were busy conserving the books so they don't get lost in war, right? So that's a different mindset, I think. So, yeah, that definitely is our times now, but what do I know what's going to be in 200 years? So, it's...
Yeah, and to that point, the conversations about like which formats to privilege, which media to privilege, it's like all the way through book history. It's like papyrus is great, no. Parchment is great, no. Paper is great, and so it's really interesting because at each turn, right, there's like different pros and cons for each material as it surfaces, and just because something is hard to conserve right this moment doesn't mean it's not hard to conserve 5 years from now or 20 years from now. Or,
and because you mentioned Booklyn, also, I mean, our books or books that go to Booklyn, they might seem fragile in that sense, but they not necessarily are. Like in my own books, even they're very fragile, there's an amount of acrylic ink and then paint over them that will do a certain, like a fairly good amount of conservation.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that's also, there's a joke in here about not judging the book by its cover, right? Like, and I think that is also really, it's definitely in our milieu, right? Like trying to figure out what we're going to do to sort of address the concerns that we're having as they're coming up. I think about how a few months ago there was a big fear of an actual paper shortage because we were just not producing enough paper to meet our needs, and now that's like not as scary as some of the other material shortages that are coming up. And we've had during our COVID times like a rotating cast of like this will be really scarce now, and then now we're in abundance, right? Avocados in California, there was a big fear that we'd run out of avocados, and now we have a massive surplus that we couldn't possibly eat.
let's see if we can draw on them.
Yeah.
But may I add something else to the whole?
Please.
Like in the case of Booklyn, look, we also work as artists that are not necessarily in the general canon of bookmaking. They're not necessarily fine printmakers and stuff. So it's also the choices you make. So for us, it's more important to find someone who is not seen and who maybe just uses a ball pen and magazine paper to express themselves as an artist, and to make that possible for libraries, so to be part of that canon, than to be busy and worry about if it's correctly used and of that,
Yeah. And I think maybe a really interesting case is I forget the name of the artist who does the embroidered books.
Oh yeah, Candace Hicks.
Yeah, Candace Hicks is right. Beautiful books.
Yeah.
And because it's primarily happening in embroidery and textile, the conservation folks who would be working with that book, right, if it is put in with books, may not actually have the conservation skills that are required to really take care of that object, even though textile conservation is pretty well defined, right? And so it's like, where does that object get to live in the big circuit of things?
Yeah.
And like, who becomes the warden of it once it is acquired and collected?
Absolutely.
And if you look about the country, like for example, in Germany, when I sell books to libraries in Germany, like they just buy it and then it's being shelved and never looked again. And it's totally different here, right? I mean, institutions, libraries, public libraries, or universities, they use the artist books in their classes. So there's a completely different way of using things and how you have to handle them.
Right.
absolutely. And it's also really interesting too. Artist books have been coming up more and more in my role as a teacher, doing like library visits and special collections visits, especially in undergrad courses, where it used to be, the undergrads were thought of as like, you cannot bring rare materials to them because they will destroy it, right? Like uniformly, they're a scary audience to give access to materials, but it's now kind of in vogue to bring rare materials to many different kinds of audiences. And I think that is also a really exciting term because it not only increases circulation for these artist books, but it's also, it's neat to create new kinds of conservation problems and protection problems where you have a group of people who will receive a kind of bare training in how to work with these materials and then get to explore them and be inspired and want to engage. And then what does that do as these materials continuously are used by these folks who are using them as the launch pad into other kinds of explorations of rare materials. I think that's really interesting. And I know that as two people who have dabbled in the sort of pedagogical space, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, institutions have really changed their mission really in terms of just being a repository for artwork to buy it, lock it away, and almost just keep it as an investment to, making it accessible and giving people access and showcasing, what they have and making it available. And that shift in priorities is really, I think what you were talking about too with the, undergrads and things like that, coming into special collections and, all these things now being made available and, conservation labs, things like that in museums have almost been under lock and key, and now museums are trying to bring them forward and exhibit them and show what goes on behind the scenes and, all these great collections and how they're caring for them and, so that, how they, view themselves, and push.
So after a little meltdown that the camera had, we're back, and Beldan was just about to talk about undergraduate pedagogy and special collections.
Yeah, I've been listening to both of you. I was like, we could also just say, let's define what a rare book actually is, right? Okay, there are books that are they're one of a kind, the artist is dead, the print is whatever, and I don't know, 300 years old. That for me is a really rare book. Let's look at my own art. Even though it would be a painful moment to hear that one of my books would be broken or got lost, it's not the end of the world. I am alive, the material is there, you could reproduce it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm also a bit like, yeah, it's great that you have the concept of a rare book and it's good to preserve stuff and everything, but my main interest is in regards of my book, and as far as I'm concerned with Booklyn, is it's material to be used. Like, do the education stuff, spread the word. I mean, this is my main intention actually. For the archives is later.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I mean, I don't have to take myself so serious in my work. It's serious enough.
The access and availability is more important than the preservation.
Especially if it's not a rare book in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
I am alive.
Yeah. I've been telling a kind of joke about trying to define what rare books are. Like Nuremberg Chronicles, right? It's often included in rare books, but there's 2,000 copies of it that exist. So it's not that rare. It's about as rare as a New York Times bestseller. So it's not a scarcity thing, right? It gets to this idea is it reproducible still, and under the same conditions? Is that the same kind of provenance? And I think that is a really interesting way to frame it. And along those same kinds of lines, I'm really curious because like as we were cooling off downstairs, we were talking a little bit about paper marblers, right? Another kind of rare material that gets circulated, and how the marblers sometimes don't want to do editions of work, which makes it hard to sell an artist's material that is immediately consumed into other projects. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, when we as TALAS try to find new marblers to work with, you know, we have fairly unique requirements in that it's a marbler who is willing to do repetition of patterns and also be very consistent from sheet to sheet that they produce, which is not always easy and sometimes also not what they want to do at all. And so finding someone who has those skills and is willing to use them in a way that is, you know, sometimes looked at as boring or monotonous as far as just reproducing a similar sheet over and over again for an order of ours that might be 50 sheets of one pattern or something, you know, is tricky. I mean, we're fortunate to have a good community of marblers that we've found over a long period of time that we work with and are continuing trying to find new ones as other ones fade away and keeping them alive and current. And but yeah, it is that sort of push and pull of, you know, working with people that are sometimes not wanting to do multiples and you'll edit out hopefully. So yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, I mean, because I think that like that's such an interesting issue, and there are some parallels with like some of the books, right, Beldan, that you were describing about you know, their use of rare materials makes them especially rare, right? I'm thinking of the example of the artist who was doing those marker books with the tape. I don't imagine these are happening.
One of a kind.
They're not in editions.
No.
Yeah.
No. It's also not his interest.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Although, if you look at the whole of his works, even though it's not an edition, you know, though it quote unquote almost doesn't matter which of his books you buy, it is his books. It's more a taste of, do you want to have this story or that story? You know?
Yeah. It's like the documentation of like a long practice as opposed to being like a single performance. Yeah, I think that that's also really interesting because it changes in some ways our relationship to like the kinds of books that we are accustomed to encountering, especially as like small bookstores over the last 20 years have closed up and reopened and closed up again, and now we are in this like interesting space where the bookstores that are the most successful are beginning to resemble each other, as opposed to having like really distinct markets that define them. And so it's interesting to think about like the kinds of books that are circulating there and how those, even if they're like, you know, zines or artist books that are done in democratic multiple editions or other kinds of controlled reproduction, right? Like how those books are going to be moving in the world very differently than say books that you'd acquire at Booklyn, or, you know, the materials that would be consumed into the books that that's coming from TALAS, right? Or like, and so I have like a kind of like speculative question about this, and it's like, how do you imagine like what this field looks like 5 years from now?
Which field?
All of it. For me, like all of this is kind of in the same field, right? Like from the very beginning, when you have the person who's like marbling paper, all the way through to the librarian who's doing the demo in the undergraduate special collections workshop, right? That this is like a series of discontinuous relationships, because without the paper marbler, right, there's no artist book. Without the artist and the artist book, then there's, you know, no like distributor or reseller. Without a distributor or reseller, the libraries aren't really able to acquire. Without acquisitions, the librarians can't actually collect and conserve, and without any impetus to collect and conserve because they're going to be used in like classroom settings or by researchers, then the whole thing kind of like falls apart. It relies on each of these individual steps and like the labor that's involved in like making sure that the product keeps moving
Right.
to keep the whole thing going.
Yeah, so I guess, in
Close the door. Sorry. I can't hear.
TALAS has been in business for about 60 years, and I think one of the things that the business really doesn't change that much that quickly. As far as the materials that we sell, they are fairly steady. I mean, there's a constant sort of churn of a few that go by the wayside and new ones that come about, but the general sort of continuum of it all is pretty steady. But a lot of that comes back down to some of the core materials that go into making a book, and just some of the core fundamentals of tools and things like that. But there certainly is a shift as keeping up with trends and certain people trying to use certain materials that convey as part of the message of what they're creating, and obviously that message goes through changes and things come in and out of vogue over time. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it will depend on where the society is in terms of what the issues are at that time, and what people are using to help convey those messages that they are working on, or producing through their art.
Okay. I can't answer it from that point. I would answer it much more from an artist point of view. I mean, on the Secession in Vienna, the saying is, time is art and art is freedom, and as such, it will always adapt. I don't know where we're going to be from 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, for me, quote unquote, I'm not going to mean it as I'm saying that. I don't care what material is there. If I want to express myself, I will find the means to express myself. Books have been declared for death many times before. I don't see that coming. There will be always artist books in one way or another. They will change their means. More important, less important. I don't quite know if it's true, but on one point I heard the story that artist books in China are a medium to speak openly about things because there's less attention on it. So there are many ways to use artist books. It will show. I mean, we have one artist, Sona Mitchell, who makes artist books where she embeds a QR code, so you can actually scan it and then you're being brought to the archives of what she's talking about. I think for me it's exciting. We are on the brink of something completely new. Maybe in 5-10 years, artist books will be much more technological. These are exciting times in that sense. So I'm curious. The artist will always find ways.
I'll add one more thing to my answer, which is I feel like where TALAS's contribution is more of like providing the canvas, and it's the artist that then overlays, the creativity on top of it, and that creativity is just in vogue with whatever is, that message or, what the environment is at that point in time. We're just providing the materials on which to, produce it on.
And for that, as an artist, I'm very happy about. And artists are different. I mean, some want to have that special paper, and some don't. And glad that you're here. Speaking about myself, I would be devastated if you wouldn't be here, but I won't stop. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask one more question that's kind of not in the flow of our conversation, just because I'm curious about it, and let me cut it. But it's about relationships, right? Like dealing in rare materials, right? Whether you're consuming them or producing them, or somewhere in between, or both, right? I think that it's interesting how much of that business comes from, like, it's not like a who you know, but it's like who are you close to kind of business. Like, who gets trusted to do the business, who is in your network, like who do you want to continue to work with, right? And so it's differentiated from other media industries where it's like, whose business card do you have, or like, whose byline did you share? And instead it's like, whose ethic do you trust, right? Who do you feel responsible with? And I was wondering if you could talk about that and how those issues around relationships show up in the kinds of work that the both of you do.
You start. I'm thinking.
It's tricky in our world because a lot of times, trying to think of things that are more really more unique and specialized. A lot of times we don't sometimes have a choice of where we're going to get a material from. There literally globally isn't a choice. There's one maker for that material and that's it. And and those are things that we have to grapple with and deal with. And I mentioned earlier about this paper maker up in Toronto, and it's a great example because their product is amazing, and they are just so unreliable to deal with. And the owner there just tells me, I'm shipping your order next week, and I know, and I can't take this information and tell a customer who's waiting, like, oh, great news, the material's going to be here in a week and a half, because I know I'm going to be calling her 6 or 8 weeks from now, begging and pleading and just asking what happened, and this just happens over and over and over again. But at the same time, we love her product, but there is no ability to shop it around and get this from somewhere else. I mean, what she makes is so unique and amazing. And I mean, at the same time, that's the beauty of it all, right? It's just that the scarcity of it, and it takes so much time to make and so much that goes into the final production of it all. But I think that there's a few times when we may have more distinct choices, but generally speaking, the material chooses us, not the other way around.
It's a nice one. It's interesting. I think librarians and curators of institutions are much more forgiving if it's an artist, because the process can't be rushed. So when I'm in a position to sell a book from other artists, I can also call every day, it won't be done,
Yeah.
So if the artist says it's going to be done in 2 weeks, it might take 2 months. Yeah. But librarians are much more forgiving because they know that it's a different process, maybe. So I'm sorry to hear that. That's interesting. I did not know that. And as far from of relationship, I think in my case or Booklyn's case, it's a different kind of relationship rely on, because we come actually from, let's use that terrible word, niche. We are mostly interested in artists that social political issues or environmental issues. So we are quote unquote an outsider on the artist book market. So we rely on people that wants to hear those voices, and wants to push a canon into different directions. So, and I don't know, I don't see a big difference in how it works in general in the world. You have to have the one-on-ones. If it clicks, it clicks. But if you look at people who are, that's networks and relations have to be built in a very close, intimate way. It doesn't work much the other way. Okay.
Yeah.
But not for 3 minutes.
I mean, I think that like, I don't think it can be, overstated, right? How like the relationship between, like the relationship really that you're mediating right, are the things you have to be most careful
Mhm.
with, because it's like at Booklyn, right? It's like the artist to Booklyn to the institutions that are doing the acquiring.
Mhm.
If at any point either side is like, you know, not so happy with what's going on, right? That could damage other flows as things are passing through. And
Yeah.
and the same thing's happening with the paper marbling or with paper manufacture, right? Somebody's waiting 12 years for this paper.
But
right?
still waiting.
But still
Yeah.
waiting.
Right.
You know, the hope is they're not waiting 13 years for this paper.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's. But yeah, you know, having those relationships with our suppliers and customers, and that trust that it is ultimately going to come together and, you know, be successful is, you know, that's what our world is built on, is, you know, those relationships and that
Yeah.
trust. And, you know, it's very important to us. I mean, even if we only have, you know, one supplier for that material, you know, there still is a relationship that must be built and nurtured and cared for. You know, it's very important.
And it goes for both ways. For Booklyn, it is the trust and our loyalty to the artist
Mm-hmm.
and to the institution.
Yeah.
You know, kind of the Brit saying, yeah. And I think, I might be wrong, but I think, yeah, of course, the book has to be delivered. But I think if you speak about disappointments from the side of an institution, would be more if we wouldn't be true to ourselves and what we want to say, what we wanted to bring to the table.
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah, I think that is such like a great ethic, right? That it's like having to build relationships where there's like a reciprocal trust that the thing that is being brought,
Yeah.
right, is being brought in good faith, and because it's important.
Yeah. I have an example for that, like
Oh,
a
yeah.
very recent and a great example. So when the Supreme Court, let's say, dismantled Roe versus Wade,
Mhm.
so we have one artist, Meredith Stern, who's a printmaker in Providence. She's like, oh, I have things about abortion prints. Would you like to have that? I was like, yeah, give us immediately. So she mailed us I think a couple of prints that addresses the issue. We made box sets, and in a week we sold out. It was an edition of 10. 5 is an object, 5 is not an object. And, you know, institutions were happy to hear from us. So that's what I mean, you know, the expectations you know, that's how, you know, we work. I lost my train of thought. But that is a very quick moment. The artist reminds us they have work, and we said, yeah, we want to do that, and we didn't even have to make an effort. Institutions were waiting for that. So, you know, that's a great moment, even if it's a terrible subject.
Yeah. And that Booklyn was able to be so responsive because of the strength of those relationships, I think is
The strength of the
something really great.
relationship, the knowing of it will resonate, or, you know, and the taking of the risk.
Mhm.
And that's what I very much like with Booklyn, because again, these are not standard. I shouldn't do that. These are not. Sometimes they are hard themes, you know. But we have a trust that we will be able to provide those themes to the institutions, and we are willing to take the risk, even if it won't work. But we believe in it, so we will take the risk, you know. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you would always get the thing that repeats itself.
Well, so I've asked a lot of questions, but I was wondering if, as we were talking, if there were questions that either of you were thinking about that you'd want to pose, because this is like a nice opportunity to think about the issues of circulating rare materials.
Question for you.
Sure.
How do you see, would you like, you or TALAS, would you like to work in a different way with artists? What would you like in regards of artists?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, input is always, you know, so valuable. And so, you know, to hear people saying, you know, what they would love to see in a material or a paper, or I wish I had a paper that was like this color with this pattern on it, or who knows what, but just, you know, constant sort of feedback and just information in terms of what people are looking for on an ongoing basis really helps us, you know what to be on the lookout for as things come our way. And, you know, because we are approached by different, also artists producing different types of papers or materials or things like that all the time. And, you know, and we're choosing things based on, you know, what we think is appropriate, but, you know, having more input from the greater community, you know, is amazing. And, you know, because you always try to ask for it, and then a lot of times it's just crickets. And, you know, it's a lot of times you're just blindsiding somebody, you know. But when it's like when an artist is in the moment and, you know, looking for that thing, and they can sort of articulate what they want, you know, is when they have, you know, that information to share, not when we necessarily approach them. So, so that would be a great thing to, you know, get more of on an ongoing basis.
Okay.
So thank you again, Beldan and Aaron, for joining me today to talk about issues in rare material circulation, and I'm very excited to see where rare materials show up next.
Okay.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It was quite fun, actually. Nice meeting both of you.
Of course.